Good afternoon. I'm Makiyah Moody with Lapiana Consulting, and I'm thrilled to have this conversation with Marcus Walton, CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, also known as GEO. Hey, Marcus.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. I've been reflecting on when I first met you in the fall of 2019 in Chicago at Equity in the Center's convening, where you were on
Yes,
a panel with Dr. Gail
yes.
Christopher and shared a lot of insights about the racial hierarchy in this country, the fallacy of the racial hierarchy that's in this country. And so I'm excited to hear from you about your current work at GEO, as well as what has brought you to this place. How's life?
Well, we're in a special moment in history, apparently. Global pandemic is the language that's often used. And yet life is full of possibility. Um, there was a moment there where maybe it took about a solid month or so to ground myself in a new reality, kind of release some of the things that I was really looking forward to in terms of plans or strategies, um, leading into maybe March, April. But coming out of that, I'm really eager to explore what's possible in this new context where, there's some opportunity for change, for advancing change in a way that wasn't apparent before. So uh, it's really exciting. It's certainly uncertain, and at the same time, that's what makes it intriguing. Yeah,
Right.
one
So,
that's a fan of leading change has to embrace this kind of moment. I mean, it's a rare occasion.
right, it certainly is. Are you able to lift up maybe one area where you would say it's the most exciting thing that you're currently working towards in your current role while navigating a global pandemic?
How about that? So yes, thank you for that. There's a way in which I talk about philanthropy at its core as an expression of love for all mankind, right? And like just core essential elements, and it's been institutionalized as more of a supportive process for communities that are being impacted in particular ways. But thriving is at its core. And so when I think about what's the opportunity to optimize thriving in this moment, there's a couple of different ways. So my most ambitious way, because it's you, and and I appreciate this opportunity, the most audacious thought that recurs for me is around the opportunity to transform our public education system. Imagine, imagine if in this moment where there's some school programs have very good e-learning infrastructure, some do not, probably the majority don't have a strong system in place. Instead of focusing the energy over the summer for developing a digital version of traditional practice, what would it look like to imagine a different system altogether? I mean, I've seen over the years plenty of experts wax poetic around potential alternative models to the daytime summer off, you know, uh, model. And I just think education offers a very clear example of where there's existing notions of how change can happen. Why not explore them? Maybe pilot a couple, maybe, take a couple of strategies, year-long learning versus digital versus, it just strikes me as an opportunity to, while we're already pausing, just a little more initiative and be a little more creative. So that's one. But on a more practical level for the sector, if that's what you were asking, uh, I'm really thinking about now. There's a lot of conversations around uh, how does philanthropy increase its impact, right? Support of thriving communities. And at GEO, we like to say strong nonprofits, because we appreciate that strong nonprofits are a critical component, variable to foster thriving communities. And so we're thinking about the way in which we convene, the way in which we come together to, one, increase our awareness, two, share our observations. So not just learning for the sake of consumption, but learning for the sake of generating ideas, sparking possibilities. I'll call that our collective genius. And so then being intentional about the cultivation of collective genius toward applying responses to various situations. And GEO in particular is focused on effectiveness. And so with our individual partners, with our members in different parts of the country, especially when it comes to rural communities, other communities that tend to be left out of mainstream conversations, we're bringing this kind of approach to coming together, cultivating that genius, and then organizing a set of conversations around a different set of possibilities than we otherwise would have on a regular basis. And believe it or not, the digital platform makes it easier, not more challenging, because we don't have to be in person and fly and do all of the kind of logistical. We don't have to account for the logistical considerations in the same way. So it might not be the most preferred way, but it actually is easier in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the silver linings of this moment while also holding like the trauma, the hurt, the pain, the uncertainty, but also being able to see like where there are positives that are emerging. And I know your background as an organizer must have been very influential in how you've developed as a person, as a professional. I'm curious about how your organizing background specifically impacts or influences how you make decisions at GEO while you're working to build awareness, engage members, really nurture that collective genius. Are there some underpinnings from your organizing background that help you do that?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I love the way you laid it out, even in the question, because that in and of itself is an organizing strategy. That is mobilization. And so the biggest takeaway from community organizing or issue organizing is that there's an end goal to the work that really has to do with the individuals engaged in the process determining their own fate, right? Self-governance, self-actualization. And so without community organizing, I think I would have more of a philanthropy needs to fix type of approach, as opposed to philanthropy as a resource to support communities to thrive, right? And by resource, we very specifically talk about philanthropy in 3 different ways. One is as a funder, right? Everyone is familiar with that. A generator of financial resources, grant dollars to support work, but it also has influence. And so how might philanthropy use its influence, which often exists in the form of networks, to connect individuals to each other toward a greater end, right? So philanthropy as a facilitator of relationships, so to speak, which is absolutely something that comes from my background. And then lastly, it's about a voice, an echo chamber. So philanthropy as an advocate. So there's a way in which you can connect relationships. There's a way in which you can reverberate. You can continue to reinforce messages that are not being heard from other places, perhaps for various reasons. And different foundations, different grant-making entities, different individuals who might have gravitas can use their platform to advance some of those messages, promote some of those messages. So that's all organizing, because again, it's not enough to just consume information. It's not even enough to have a breakthrough aha moment. There's an end goal that an organizer asks, like, to what end have you just broken through and considered a different way of experiencing the situation? And the end goal for philanthropy is to increase the quality of the experience, of the human experience for all populations, as many as possible.
So in that response, it's interesting, you mentioned that philanthropy could approach its work by trying to fix communities or fix organizations versus really letting the community or the organization lead and be self-determined in what course they're charting. And in the interview with the Bridgespan Group, you said this, quote, "This approach will put philanthropy on its head and really challenge us to think outside of the charity model and more about a change model," end quote. And I'm curious if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more on that point, because in my estimation, shifting from a charity model to a change model requires transformation. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to maybe the concrete ways that GEO is supporting members and the philanthropic sector at large to pursue such a paradigm shift from the charity model to the change model.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful question. And I wish there were a menu of ways that I can choose from. And the reality is that this vision is requiring a transformation of GEO itself. As you know, there's a history of GEO being a platform for sharing best practices for members across a variety of practices that are connected to being effective. And so one of those is, for example, focus on capacity building, like build the capacity of nonprofits in order for them to be more effective service providers for people in communities, or flexible funding. A lot of the things that we're hearing now as calls to action in philanthropy, GEO has promoted for several years and will continue to do so. However, in this moment, building upon that, acknowledging that there's an opportunity to evolve from what I would consider as the emphasis on the acquisition of information toward the application of lessons, right? Now we are emphasizing how the platform for GEO can be used to help an organization move developmentally along a continuum of progress, right? And so not just increase your information, which is amazing, not just deepen the rapport and the relationships that you've established across philanthropy as a network, which is also amazing, but also to think about how now strategically we can deploy those resources toward another end, toward a greater good, collective impact. And one of my favorite vehicles inside of GEO is our peer learning. It's our remote learning series, as a matter of fact, one of which is being organized right now, where we use what we've learned from several cohort learning experiences over the years. So there's a fellowship, for example, that GEO has done now for 3 years. There's capacity building champions. There's CEOs coming together to think about, to compare notes and explore possibilities for leading change in the sector. All of these things have happened over the years. And now this remote learning series, in part because of the opportunity that exists in the pandemic, we are expanding to a national conversation. Whereas before there were more regionally focused, smaller groups who were able to have these kind of cohort experiences. So the cohort experience is something that thankfully we have a track record of success, and we've been able to learn how to be more effective in our implementation and execution of those experiences. And our plan is to absolutely increase the extent to which we offer those to members and others in the sector during this time frame. And that would be indefinitely, right, as we consider the long-term impact of this moment.
So it sounds like peer learning is one of the vehicles by which you are trying to help philanthropy move from the charity model to the change model by helping to push their thinking along this continuum that you mentioned. Are there specific topics that the peer learning cohorts focus on, or how are the peer learning, what's the structure of the peer learning opportunities?
Yeah, well, I guess without giving out the secret sauce, the proprietary,
Okay.
effectively what we can do is provide a call to action around a theme that has emerged through various types of conversations involving GEO members, right? And so anyone who's been interested and engaged in conversations around philanthropic effectiveness can say, you know, that sometimes it'll show up on our listserv where there are these robust conversations around how to respond to different scenarios. And capacity building is one, since you mentioned that. Different people have perspectives on capacity building and how to do it effectively. Racial equity has been one of late that has been a real hotbed topic that really undergirds all that we do in philanthropy at GEO to support effective philanthropic practice. And so by taking those topics, because we're aware of the intensity of the conversations and the frequency of the topic being raised through these various platforms, we just create the opportunity for deeper dialogue for the ones that rise to the most prominent level of discussion. And sometimes we do surveys too, so we understand through survey and through evaluations that these are what members want to hear about. Like anyone else, we look at the analytics, we look at the website responses, we look at the hits on social media when different messages or topics are shared. And with those that have the highest numbers, the highest rates of response, that also determines how we identify a topic. But suffice it to say, those peer learning experiences are facilitated. And so one of the things that makes it a really special opportunity is that the facilitator is expert in different aspects of the conversation. So sometimes it's an expert in the topic itself. So racial equity, you have a racial equity facilitator over the course of 1 or 2 days, moving the group through a set of conversations. The other, which is just the secret sauce of peer learning as an approach, is that we tend to learn best from our peers, right? From people who have a shared set of experiences, a shared set of the day-to-day dynamics that influence their decision-making. And so by organizing conversation with people who have that shared experience, then there's more buy-in. Buy-in happens more quickly. It happens more organically. And the buy-in that's generated from the conversation can be translated into agreements for action. So that's the mobilization. Without the agreements, then there's no accountability. Like, what is holding us together? How do we know that what we just learned translates into some set of steps? And so it's within these spaces where trust is created, some level of trust and rapport has been cultivated. That forms the safe environment. It creates the kind of environment that's conducive to making agreements that can be used for accountability over time.
Great. Yeah, I imagine there's a lot of adult learning theory that must have to go into the thinking and the preparing of those peer learning cohorts. So shifting a little bit to your membership, do you have any thoughts and or examples of how your members are kind of transforming themselves in this particular moment to better support grantees beyond funding? Like, is there anything that's innovative that your members have been trying on for size during a global pandemic?
Yeah, that's, it's pretty early. It's still, we're 10, I just heard someone say we're like 10 weeks and 20 something days to the experience. And so the early indicators are connected to some calls to action that we've supported. One of which was encouraging foundations to think about the payout, the percentage of their overall assets that goes towards grant making. So legally speaking, there's in order to maintain nonprofit status, foundations are required by law to give 3% of their overall assets. But it doesn't stop you from giving more. A foundation can give 30% of assets in 1 year if they chose to do so. And so we chose to point to that space as like, hey, during this time of historic change, consider the possibility of increasing your payout to nonprofits for all of the reasons that we've come to learn recently, which is that nonprofits tend to have less of a financial cushion. So there's less reserves for being in business over time in response to any kind of economic downturn or unforeseen delays or barriers. And so the payout conversation has been an interesting one. It generated a lot of debate, and I thought that debate was healthy because, again, the strategy is by creating the conversation and encouraging us to think about a different set of possibilities, then we're tapping into our collective genes. And so whether people actually act on it or not, the strong consideration reinforces certain points that we also want to make related to the consideration of giving more to nonprofits. It just allows the dialogue, the focus to be different. Not despair, certainly, but more on whether it's this or that. What type of change, not whether it's change versus charity. You see what I mean? And so that's exciting. Another thing that we found our colleagues doing is actually being more collaborative. There's a way in which foundations have been accused of traditionally, some fairly, some not necessarily accurately, but operating in silos. You know, there's our resources, there's our focus. The field might be pursuing these other conversations, but we have our strategy and we're gonna stick to that. Now I'm starting to hear people ask each other, hey, how have you thought about your strategy in response to the pandemic? And that, I'll just call that coordination. Whether there's a decision to work collaboratively or not, do something together, the conversation to make decisions that are informed by other people's activities, to me, is the direction that we want to go. We want to be leveraging each other's progress for the greater good. And so it always behooves us to understand who is doing what, where, right? What are the types of advocacy conversations or campaigns that are underway, for example, that are really demonstrating the kind of progress that we support that can be connected to something that we're thinking about inside of our foundation, for example. That's an example of how we identify progress amongst our membership in support of the triple bottom line, right? The resources, the quality of the experience, and the collective greater good experience of an investment.
Yeah, as you were speaking, in the back of my mind, I was thinking about the Power Moves assessment from the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy.
Love it.
That lifts up, you know, building power, sharing power, and wielding power, and is an opportunity for foundations to really interrogate how they leverage their resources, if they are helping to cultivate thriving communities by actually helping to shepherd communities on their journey to self-determination, potentially. And so there's, I think, hopefully, that's also one vehicle that foundations are using in order to pivot from the charity model to the change model.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, if I may. There's a way in which there's just two favorite resources of mine for the sector. that GEO is really intentional about connecting into and integrating into our work. One is power moves. Thank you very much for acknowledging that, and just the awareness of power, how it plays out. Not define power broadly as the ability to achieve one's goals, right? The ability to get things done. If we just think about power in that way and consider all of the different ways in which our ability to get things done can be impeded or delayed or just stalled completely, right? That's what we're talking about when we refer to equity. And so if colleagues in the sector could appreciate one thing around, if you were to ask, like, what's a pet peeve of yours in the sector that you would love to change? I would say, I would appreciate a demystified approach to promoting work in the sector, ways of doing business within philanthropy, ways of grant making that humanize the experience, move barriers as opposed to, and build trust as opposed to creates barriers and erodes trust, as my colleagues from Peak Grant Making would say. So yeah, there's just so much brilliance amongst the sector. I think being intentional about cultivating and curating that is a worthy exploration and nothing else. That's what we're committed to at GEO.
Awesome. Well, my takeaway from this conversation, there are many, but collective genius is something I'm going to be holding on to as I think about engagements with other clients and just people in general, and how there's benefit in trying to stimulate and surface and leverage the collective genius of individuals that are at the table to help create a better future. And so I thank you for engaging in this conversation with me. It's always nice to chat with you.
Likewise.
And I wish you and your colleagues at GEO well as you continue to navigate these uncertain waters that we all seem to be in.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is such a special, anytime, Makiyah, I get a chance to engage with you, it's fun. But like, if I could just underscore here, what you do, that's really important. If in case no one has shared any kind of explicit feedback with you, you allow me to spend time in considering what's possible as opposed to overindulging perhaps in what's practical. And I just think the practical is what has left us unfulfilled. And the possible, really operating outside of our comfort zone, is where the real opportunity, particularly in this moment, exists. And that whole learning approach and GEO's approach to engaging the sector is really about supporting ourselves and each other through moving through our discomfort, right? Outside of our comfort zones to explore what's possible.